Right, we've still got a few more to join, but it's 9:30 now, so we'll get started. So hello everyone and welcome along to this presentation on high net worth estate planning with a particular focus on inheritance tax planning. By way of introduction, my name is Conor McManus. I'm one of the private client tax managers here in the Woking office. I specialise in inheritance tax trusts and estates, and I'm also one of the authorised individuals for probate purposes. I'm also joined today by my colleague Tamsin.
Hello everyone, I'm Tamsin. I'm a financial planner at Menzies Wealth Management, and I work closely alongside Conor and the rest of the private client tax team here at Menzies.
Firstly, I'd just like to say thanks to all of you for joining this morning. Really appreciate you coming along. I'm sure that we've got lots of answers to all of your inheritance tax questions. But if you do have any questions as we move throughout the presentation, please pop these in the box. We've got some time at the end for some questions, and we can pick those up then. If we don't quite get around to all of them, we'll follow up directly with each of you separately. I think it's also just worth touching on the recent autumn statement. Obviously, there was lots of conversation beforehand of potentially abolishing inheritance tax, which would have made this webinar quite easy today. That didn't happen, and in fact, they didn't touch inheritance tax at all. We don't really see it likely that it would ever be abolished, and more likely in the future there may be a major reform at some stage, but there's plenty on their plate at the moment to worry about before looking at any inheritance tax changes right now. So yeah, just running through what we're going to be touching on today. So just an intro to inheritance tax, touching on some general mitigation strategies, how Menzies approach inheritance tax planning for high net worth individuals. Tamsin will detail the cash flow modelling software and how we incorporate that into our inheritance tax planning, and then a case study, and then some time at the end for some questions. So, inheritance tax. Firstly, who is liable to inheritance tax? So anyone who is UK domiciled will be subject to inheritance tax on their worldwide assets. So if they have property in Spain, France, Australia, that would all need to be taken into consideration when calculating somebody's UK inheritance tax position. On the other side, if you have somebody who's not UK domiciled, they would only be subject to inheritance tax on their UK assets. So this might be UK property, a UK bank account, or UK stocks and shares. And domicile is an interesting topic. It's one where it's not completely black or white. Just because you're resident somewhere doesn't mean you're necessarily domiciled there. And there's a few factors at play when determining someone's domicile. So if you're unsure on your domicile, please do get in touch, and we can help establish that. The headline rate of inheritance tax, I'm sure you're all aware, is a big 40%. That does mean that if we, even with a little bit of planning, we can save quite significant amounts of tax. And then the main reliefs. So everyone's entitled to a tax-free threshold of £325,000, known as the nil rate band. So if you have a property, for example, worth £300,000 and a bank account with £20,000, you're under this threshold and you wouldn't be subject to inheritance tax. This can be extended up to £500,000, where you're eligible for the residence nil rate band. I say eligible for because there are some conditions. The main one being that you need to leave a former residence, a property that you've lived in, to a lineal descendant, so that would be children or grandchildren. And that is also tapered away if you have estates worth over 2 million. So a typical couple may have tax-free thresholds up to £1 million for inheritance tax purposes, where they're eligible for all the reliefs. Charitable legacies, so these are completely free of inheritance tax. So any gifts left to charity in a will won't be subject to inheritance tax. And there's also a further incentive that if 10% of the net estate is left to charity, that headline rate of 40% actually reduces to 36%. And finally, business property relief and agricultural property relief, known as BPR and APR. So these are very, very valuable reliefs. APR generally applies more to farmland, and BPR to more trading assets. So if you've got a family trading company, the full value of that company may be entirely exempt from inheritance tax under BPR. So as you can see, it's potentially a very invaluable relief.
So planning for inheritance tax can be relatively complex, but at a high level, there are 4 main strategies for inheritance tax planning. And the first is to spend it. But failing that, if you can't spend it all, or don't want to spend it all because you want to leave a legacy to family, there's also the option to insure a liability. So it's not reducing the inheritance tax liability, but providing your beneficiaries with a means of paying the tax bill through an insurance policy. Invest it. There are certain investments available, which we'll touch on a little bit later, which are very efficient for inheritance tax. And then finally, gift it. And gifting is really the main strategy for inheritance tax planning, and clearly to provide legacy to family.
So when we look at a mitigation strategy, we look at various options. This list isn't exhaustive. However, these are some of the key ones that we look at, and we're going to kind of move from your more simple planning up to more complex structures. It's not necessary always that we have to use the most complex structures and frameworks. If an outright gift works, then it works, and it's easier to keep it simple. But just touching on some of these, so the annual exemption, everyone receives a £3,000 annual exemption every year, which means you can give away up to £3,000 free of inheritance tax. Outright gifts, which you'll probably all most commonly know as the 7-year rule. So if somebody makes an outright gift to an individual and they survive 7 years from the date of that gift, it will fall entirely outside their estate for inheritance tax purposes. If they were sadly to pass away within the 7 years, there is potentially some tapering as if that person survives 3 or more years after the date of gift. And finally, the gift set of income, which is a little lesser known relief. This is more applied where if you have somebody with quite high income, you knock off their income tax bill, you knock off their annual expenses, which would include sort of bills, groceries, and then you get left with effectively surplus income. This income can actually be gifted away entirely free of inheritance tax, so it doesn't fall into that 7-year rule. HMRC say that these gifts must be regular, so gifts would need to either be made sort of monthly, quarterly, or annually to meet that condition.
Insurance. So as I touched on just now, a policy to provide your beneficiaries with the means of paying an inheritance tax bill. 2 main types of policy here: a term assurance plan, which covers a fixed term, or there's a whole of life policy, which, as the name suggests, will absolutely pay out because it covers the whole of your life. Whole of life cover is typically relatively expensive because it will provide a guaranteed sum assured at the end, and term assurance can provide a more affordable means of providing insurance for a period of time where it's deemed most important. And we always suggest that these policies should be written in trust so that it doesn't compound the inheritance tax liability, i.e. the sum assured would fall outside of your estate into trust for your beneficiaries.
Yeah, so touching on trusts, so when you hear people talk about trusts, the most common type of trust they're probably talking about is a discretionary trust. They're the most commonly used in inheritance tax planning. And the reason for that is that it maintains an element of control and protection. So as with nearly all inheritance tax planning, you ultimately have to give something away. But the trust allows the individual who gifts the assets away to maintain that element of control. So it's best presented by way of an example. So with a discretionary trust, you might have parents set up the trust. There would be the set laws. They would name trustees, usually also themselves, and the trustees control the trust assets. So they maintain control on what the trust invests in. They maintain control on when money is distributed from the trust. And then also one beneficial factor of a discretionary trust is you can name a class of beneficiaries. So you would usually in a family trust name all children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, maybe all future spouses of those individuals. And these individuals don't have to be alive at the date the trust is created. So you could have a grandchild that's born and then they would automatically become a potential beneficiary of the trust. As I say, it just maintains the element of control. So although the parents have given away the asset, they can still hold on to it in a way that they can decide when the income and capital ultimately passes down the generation. Interest in possession trusts are similar, but they're a little bit more rigid, just not as flexible as discretionary trusts. And then bear trusts are effectively transparent. So a bear trust is most commonly seen where parents are holding assets on behalf of a child. The beneficiary does actually hold the asset personally, but just for legal reasons, it's held through a bear trust.
So here we've got special trusts, discounted gift trust and loan trust, which some of you may have heard of. These investments are quite similar, but with a key difference. So both are essentially investment bonds integrated within a trust. And both provide the ability to pay you an income whilst allowing your capital to fall into trust for the benefit of your beneficiaries. A loan trust, as the name suggests, is literally a loan of capital into the trust. So there's no actual gift as such. So capital is loaned into the trust, and then you have the ability to call back the loan at any time, and that can be structured in the form of a regular income. But the growth of the capital, any investment growth experienced, falls into the trust for your beneficiaries. A discounted gift trust is different in that it is a gift of capital, but with a predetermined fixed income for life set at outset. So a discounted gift trust is typically less flexible than a loan trust because you can't call back all of the original capital. You can just receive an income. But a discounted gift trust does typically lead to greater IHT saving than a loan trust. But both are very useful tools, and the right one is very much dependent upon individual circumstances.
So family investment companies, which seem to be becoming more and more popular as time goes on. And I should just say on all of these examples, we are talking at this stage quite a high level. Each of these subjects could almost have a whole webinar in themselves. We can really delve down, and they can be quite complex. But just to give you a flavour of each of them, and a family investment company is pretty much as it says on the tin. It's a company where the shareholders are all family members. They vary they widely vary because they can be set up in many different ways, and they can be completely made bespoke to the family dependent on their long-term aims and goals. So just talking and giving a brief example, maybe a typical structure would be parents set up a company and they hold perhaps the A shares, which just hold voting rights. So that gives them control over the company. The children would then hold the income and capital rights. And then we may also have some trusts alongside that, dependent, as I say, on the complexity. The parents would then loan in a sum of money, let's just say, for example, £1 million into the family investment company, and the company would then invest that money. again, the parents, as the voting right holders, would be able to control what the company invests into. And all of the growth on that investment, in a way similar to a loan trust, all the growth would fall towards the capital shares, which are held by the children. And then the parents wouldn't be able to be entitled to income or capital. However, they would be able to draw down on that loan tax-free over time. So the long-term aim is that parents slowly draw a tax-free income from the company, and that slowly reduces their loan balance. And then all the growth in the company falls on the children. And it's always quite hard to quantify growth and say, no, all the future growth falls outside the estate. And it's sort of, well, what is the value to that? And that's where, as we touch on later, the cash flow modelling will really sort of quantify that growth for you and show sort of getting assets outside the estate early and getting that growth outside the estate early can make a big difference in the long run.
So other areas here, pensions. Pensions can be really useful when inheritance tax planning. And that's because pensions fall outside of the estate for inheritance tax purposes. And so in some situations, it can be beneficial to draw down on other assets first before a pension. So i.e. drawing down on assets which are subject to inheritance tax and leaving the pension until last, which is completely outside of the estate. So that can be a good strategy in some situations. It's really important always to make sure that pension nominations are set up correctly, so that you ensure that your pension is left to those intended. AIM investments here, so alternative investment market investments and BPR, business property relief qualifying investments. These sit at the higher end of the risk scale, and they invest in shares of small unquoted companies or companies quoted on the AIM market, the alternative investment market. So they are higher risk, but they do offer inheritance tax saving after 2 years. And so in some situations, they can be very useful. So there are 3 key professionals who can assist and help with inheritance tax planning and estate planning. Firstly, solicitors, who can assist with wills. Wills are absolutely crucial in the estate planning process. Lasting powers of attorney, so providing somebody else with the legal right to make decisions on your behalf if you're unable to make those decisions for yourself. And you can provide that authority in relation to health and also in relation to finance. Solicitors can draft letters of wishes and trust deeds and assist with probate. So then a financial advisor, wealth manager, can assist with pension planning, investments, cash flow modelling, which we will come on to in a little bit, which is an incredibly useful exercise when inheritance tax planning and estate planning, and then life cover. And then your accountant and tax advisor can provide advice in relation to gifting, trusts, family investment companies. They can also assist with probate and with tax returns.
So as we said there, we see those 3 key professionals being pivotal and bringing those together in dealing with an estate and coming up with the estate planning. At Menzies, obviously, we have ourselves on the accounting and tax advisory side, and we have MWM, who are IFAs. So when we look to do estate planning for high net worth individuals, we've set out a general sort of step-by-step framework for clients, and we would generally look to approach the planning in this format, keeping it quite nice and clear to the client what the next steps are. So we would always look to have an initial meeting with a member of the LLP and MWM. It's great to get that wider range of expertise at the outset and bringing the dual perspectives to the meeting. In that meeting, we'd look to establish the assets and liabilities of the client, and then we would look to outline the inheritance tax position as at today's date. So if they were to pass away today, this is the estimated position. We would then encourage the client to sit down with the MWM contact to build a cash flow model. This is a very tailored timeline. It can account for sort of your income requirements. It can account for life events on there, such as if you've got a big holiday planned, you want to retire on X date, you want to help your children buy a property. That can all be factored in to really create a bespoke position for the client, and it gives us a better understanding of the long-term family requirements. We would then, at this stage, look to implement an inheritance tax strategy report, and we would incorporate the cash flow model that has been previously produced, because ultimately the answer that might mitigate the most inheritance tax isn't always the one that best suits the family and their needs and goals. So it's bringing that cash flow model in, bringing in the wider needs of the family, and tailoring the report to really meet that client's position. Once that report is sent out, we would send out a recommendation as well ourselves. However, the client will no doubt have lots of questions that come out of that. So we would have a follow-up meeting, go through those questions, and it's at this stage as well we would tweak that report to really tailor it to the client. In the report, we may be recommending the use of a family investment company or trusts, and the client may say, "Oh, that's a little bit too complex. I'd rather keep things a little bit more simple, or are not as comfortable giving away that much capital, so maybe a loan trust is more appropriate." So we have those conversations at that stage. We agree the next steps, and then we look to implement this. So, as I say, if it's to put life cover in place, Tamsin and her team can help. If we need to set up some trusts and we need some trust deeds drafted, we can get local solicitors. And similarly, if we're looking at sort of doing family investment companies or outright gifts, we can then look at bringing in the relevant teams to make that happen. And then finally, the ongoing engagement. This is never a do a plan once and that's it. The tax rates change, family circumstances change. There may be grandchildren born, there may be health issues, there may be a divorce, and that can all lead to quite significant changes in what the family want and need. And so it's important to just touch base every few years to make sure we're on top of things, and if there are changes needed, we can reassess and bring these in.
Cash flow modelling is an incredibly useful tool, and we use it increasingly here at Menzies Wealth Management. It can be used for most areas of financial planning, but it does lend itself particularly well to inheritance tax planning and estate planning. And the main reason for that is because it really helps to contextualise wealth over the course of your whole lifetime. It helps to clearly identify what's income and what's capital, and what's income now and projections of future income streams, and how your capital is likely to behave over the course of time based on various different assumptions about inflation and growth rates. And that then really helps to establish how much capital you might need to supplement your income over the course of your life, and how much capital and potentially income is spare for gifting. And so it's all about the balance between looking after your family and providing a legacy for your family, but also ensuring your own financial security over the long term. So these slides are intended just to give you a feel for the cash flow process and the kind of information that we gather when building one of these models. So this is an example of a balance sheet. So we look to understand all of your assets, and once we have all of that, we can have an idea of the total value of your estate, which then allows us to calculate the current inheritance tax liability, and also to be able to project a future inheritance tax liability based, of course, on various different assumptions. So this tool is extremely useful. This is an example of a timeline, and we look to build one of these for all of our clients, and we can extend the timeline. We can set it at whichever age you choose and feel is reasonable. And then along the timeline, we can plot various different events and goals. And the idea is that when we're going through this process and working with the private tax team, that we're making the plan as bespoke as possible and as meaningful as possible to you. And that really involves understanding what matters to you, your family dynamics, because of course inheritance tax is simply one piece of the puzzle. It's about making sure that your wealth is passed down to your beneficiaries in exactly the way you intend. And so the timing of that is crucial, and the method is crucial. This is an example of an income versus outflows chart. So each bar on this graph represents 1 year's worth of inflow. The black line at the top is the outgoings. So this is the target outgoings, which would be made up of basic, essential outgoings, food and bills, and then we can build in discretionary spending as well. And this system also cleverly calculates any tax as well. So that's all factored into that black line. And then each bar shows how those outgoings could be met, calling upon income and different assets. So the various different income streams and assets are shown by the different colours. So here, for example, the dark blue is state pension, and the purple is rental income. And then the pale blue at the top is drawing on savings and investments to supplement the income because there's a shortfall. And this graph is projecting assets, capital assets, over a lifetime. Purple is property in this example. Pink is cash. Blue, dark blue here is investments, invested funds, and green is a pension pot. And so it's projecting over time how those assets might behave based on the drawdown levels that we'd put in and based on growth rate assumptions. So here we have a case study which will hopefully bring it all to life. So we've got Mr. and Mrs. Lancaster. So Mr. Lancaster is 63 and his wife is 60. They have 2 children aged 32 and 30. So Catherine, their daughter, the 32-year-old, is married with 1 child, and she has another child on the way. And Darren, their son, is 30. He's not married. He doesn't have children. And he's currently in a stable relationship, but in the past, it's been less stable for him, and he has had various problems. So their assets, all jointly owned unless stated. So they've got cash of 100,000, ISA investments of 300,000 between them. Their home is £1 million. They're also lucky enough to have a second property in the UK, which is valued at £500,000. And their son currently lives in the property and pays them a nominal rent. They've also got a holiday home in Spain, which is valued at about £300,000. Mr. Lancaster has a pension pot valued at £900,000. It's a self-invested personal pension. And Mr. Lancaster has just sold the family business, the family company, and they expect to receive £2.5 million net of taxes. So this means their total estate is worth 5.6 million. So we are aware that these clients are wealthy, and it's important to say that we do look after many clients who don't have total estate of 5.6 million, but we've built this case study to try to illustrate various different planning points. So they would like to provide or contribute towards school fees for their grandchildren if possible. They would also, they're mindful of the possibility of long-term care in the future. So they want to make sure that they've got enough capital and income to pay for that if it was ever required. They are interested, they'd like to help their children, but they are concerned about bloodline protection. And I think that relates particularly to their son based on his past problems with previous relationships. They would like to receive ideally £100,000 in income throughout their life. And another key objective, of course, is that they'd like to mitigate inheritance tax where at all possible. So we've built a cash flow model for these clients, and we'll show you the outputs. We've made a few assumptions. So inflation, we've assumed, is at 3% a year. And of course, inflation has been much higher of late, but we've chosen 3% as a reasonable long-term average annual rate of inflation. We've assumed that all their cash receives an interest rate of 2.5%. And again, cash at the moment, you can achieve higher interest rates than 2.5, but we were keen to show that cash just falling short of the inflation level here over the long term. And for any assets which are invested, we've assumed growth of 6% a year. So that's 3% over and above inflation. What we haven't put here, but I'll mention, is that their property assets, we've assumed would keep pace with inflation, so growing at 3% a year. And then we've also assumed within these models that they will make use of their exempt gift allowances of £3,000 each a year. So this is the base plan. And what we've got here is showing a projection of assets over the course of their life. And this is on the assumption that they do draw their £100,000 income each year. So you can see at the bottom there, they've got their property, that's shown in purple. Then they've got their invested funds, and that does include the proceeds of the business sale. That's in dark blue. They've got their savings in pink, and then they've got the pension pot in green. And what this is showing is that at the end of this plan, which is age 90 for the youngest client, then their total assets are projected to be worth over £15 million. And that just shows the power of the compounded growth and compounded inflation over time. So £15 million at the end of their plan. And that means that inheritance tax, the projected inheritance tax at the end of the plan, is just over £5.7 million.
Yeah, I think as well it's worth noting there that their current assets as at date are 5.6 million, and if they do nothing, currently their estimated inheritance tax is going to be 5.7 million. So yeah, it just the cash flow modelling allows us to really quantify the level of growth and apply that to show, although the IHT position may not look so bad now, if you don't do anything about it, then the problem will only get worse as time goes on. I think it's worth noting the base plan as well. So with these clients, they were going to start drawing their pension to meet their sort of £100,000 income, because they've now retired, and they thought, well, we'll just start drawing our pension to meet that income. One of the solutions that we came up with and discussed, and you probably hear it quite often, is drawing on the pension last, and then seeing the impact that can have. The other solutions that we looked at for this particular client, Tamsin, sorry, can you go to the next slide? So drawing on the pension last, and we'll show the cash flow modelling allows you to do sort of what if functions, show, well, if we were to draw on that last, this is what the inheritance tax position will look like. So we'll go through what we discussed as solutions, and then Tamsin will show how the cash flow recalculates the tax. So we also talked about the parents want to make some gifts to children. So they're looking at, in this case, we looked at giving a £500,000 gift to the daughter. That would be an outright gift. They're not as worried, given that she's in a stable relationship and with children, and they're looking at upsizing their property. So looking at giving a bit of a cash balance. Alongside that, we recommended they take some life insurance out, a term assurance for that 7-year period, just to insure against the liability should they pass away within those 7 years. We also looked at the second property that the son currently lives in. You may have noted, so that property was purchased for £200,000. It's currently worth £500,000. Even if they wanted to gift that to their son, there would be an immediate capital gains tax charge on that. The use of a trust allows the property to move into trust and hold over the gain, so there would be no capital gains tax charge. The trust would have the son as a beneficiary, so he could live there. It would also protect him should in the future he get married and then divorced. That property wouldn't come in, or unlikely to come into play, when assessing his assets for divorce purposes, so it adds an element of protection. And then finally, we looked at a loan trust. So these clients, age 60 and 63, they're relatively young for inheritance tax planning purposes. And so they were slightly uncomfortable in, they didn't want to give too much capital away, just in case they ever needed it back. So they're looking at putting £500,000 into a loan trust. The growth on that trust will sit outside their estate, and they're planning on hopefully using that growth to help pay for grandchildren's school fees. But then they've also got that insurance policy effectively, where if they ever do need the capital back, they can always draw down on it in that way. So Tamsin will show now we've then modelled these in what if functions into the cash flow, and this will highlight sort of the tax savings.
So what if draw on pension last? As Connor said, it was always these clients' assumption that when they retired, Mr. Lancaster has just sold his business, and they assumed, well, of course, we'll draw down on our pension to provide a retirement income. But this illustrates what the position could be if actually you didn't draw on the pension and drew down on other assets instead. And so this is now showing, you can see more green on this chart compared to the previous one, because the pension is being left untouched, it's being allowed to grow. And it shows that total assets at the end of the plan are now projected to be over £16 million. So that's more than the base plan total assets. And this is the same drawdown amount, I should say. It's still receiving £100,000 each year. But the total assets are projected to be over £16 million. And that's the impact of allowing the pension to continue growing in a very tax-friendly environment and drawing down on other taxable assets. And so whilst the total estate value is now higher than the base plan, the projected inheritance tax liability for this plan is lower than the base plan. So we're now looking at projected inheritance tax liability of just over £4 million. This scenario is what if they gifted their property into discretionary trust for the benefit of their son. So they've now completely gifted one property, and this now shows that their total assets are projected to be valued at just over £12.6 million at the end of their plan by age 90 for Mrs. Lancaster. And projected inheritance tax at the end of the plan is now £2.7 million. I should say we've built these what-if scenarios up in layers. So this is also assuming that they draw on the pension last and gift the property into discretionary trust for their son. And so this next scenario is doing those two things and also gifting £500,000 to their daughter. So it's making it equal between the value of the property gifted to their son into trust, and now they're gifting £500,000 to their daughter. And perhaps they feel, given that their daughter's situation is a bit more stable, perhaps they feel more confident in making an outright gift to their daughter. And so this would be treated as a potentially exempt transfer. And so this is now showing that at the end of the plan, their total assets are projected to be valued at just over £9.7 million, with projected inheritance tax at the end of the plan of just over £1.5 million. And then a further idea, so again, building up in layers, so they do all of those things. And then also we looked at what if they placed £500,000 into a loan trust. And so this is showing that the growth on that £500,000 would fall outside of their estates into the trust for the benefit of their family. And this is now showing that their total estate is projected to be valued at just over £8.6 million, with projected inheritance tax of just over £1.2 million. And so whilst on the face of it, it looks like, that their estate is lower value, and that's not a good thing. Of course, these assets are still there within the family. It's just that they've been gifted either into trust or directly. So before planning, the inheritance tax was projected at just over £5.7 million. And after implementing these various planning ideas, their inheritance tax liability is projected at just over 1.2 million. And that results in a potential inheritance tax saving of just over £4.5 million.
So we won't run through all the what-ifs on this situation, but this is just to highlight a reassessment. So if the client was to come back in 10, 15 years, what we might then consider to be more appropriate planning. As we said, the loan trust is we generally find younger clients prefer it because they can still have that access to capital. But it may be as they get older and they have a more handle on, well, we know how much we're going to need to live, that it's not as necessary or appropriate to need the capital back. So 10 to 15 years on, we would adjust the plan for amended income requirements. As they've gotten older, they may say, look, we don't need £100,000 net anymore. We actually need a reduced amount. So that will free up a little bit more capital, and we can model for all of that. They may also look at their main residence. It's a big family home and say, look, we're getting older. We don't need this size of house. We may want to downsize to a bungalow, for example. Again, that should free up quite significant capital. And it may be with that significant capital, they look at implementing a discounted gift trust. So that would provide them with a guaranteed tax-free income source for the rest of their life. while after 7 years, the amount gifted into that trust being completely outside of their estate for inheritance tax purposes. Finally, they may look at the Spanish property. They may say, look, we're not using that as frequently anymore the older we get. So they could, again, you may have noted at the start that that property is sitting with a gain, and there'll probably be a further gain sort of 10 to 15 years on. So there's a problem that if they gift that outright, there's going to be a capital gains tax liability. So again, they can make use of a trust, move that property into the trust, hold over the gain, and get that out of their estate again. And then lastly, with the loan trust, as I said, over time, they may have, it's almost an insurance policy, that 500,000 that they loaned in, they've never taken any of it, they never needed it. So they might say, look, we're never going to need it. So they can actually gift that loan down a generation. So it may be their son and daughter now have that loan and they can start drawing tax-free on that loan as well. So it just highlights that, putting one plan in place isn't a plan for life. As circumstances change, we also adjust to try and further maximise the savings. And then, finally, sorry, just again, if they have extra capital, one of their requirements, obviously, to pay for school fees, so they could just make some outright gifts directly either to the school in order to pay for those and help pay for those. Right, there should be a poll that comes up on screen just with a few questions regarding the presentation. So just be helpful to know if there's anything in particular in this presentation that you would like to know more on. We appreciate some of the stuff is probably quite high level, but hopefully gives you a good flavour of the sort of planning that we do here at Menzies and bringing together both sides of the business in order to collaborate to reach that desired goal for the client. I do appreciate as well that we have slightly run over time, so apologies for that if you do have to leave. But if there are, if you have any questions, please either pop them in the chat or you can follow up with us directly afterwards as well. Right, a good mix on responses on the poll as well, so that's good to see. And then finally, just the key takeaways today, which Tamsin will run through.
Yes, so we've tried to summarise here the key points. So firstly, to establish your main objectives and to really think hard about exactly what you're wanting to achieve in terms of the legacy to your family and the timing, to identify income and capital requirements and to be quite clear on that. And that then allows us to assist with helping to calculate the amount of capital that may be needed to supplement your income over the course of your lifetime. And that process allows us to identify how much income and or capital is spare for gifting. We suggest where possible to make use of the exempt gift allowances, and then to consider potentially exempt transfers, bearing in mind that 7-year window, considering the use of trusts, the pros and the cons, and how they can really be tailored to suit your family situation. Life insurance, particularly useful to when making gifts, bearing in mind that 7-year window. You can ensure that the inheritance tax liability over that 7 years, also looking at term assurance and looking at whole of life cover. Pension nomination forms, make sure that your nominations are set up correctly and to dovetail that with your will. And of course, making sure that your wills are up to date, that they accurately reflect your wishes, and that you have lasting power of attorney arrangements in place.
Right. Thanks. In terms of questions, there's a couple in the chat box. One on pensions, which I'll leave with you, Tamsin, but on the other question, so moving property into trust and whether that would constitute a stamp duty charge. So generally no, because the property would be gifted into trust, and so there's no what we call chargeable consideration paid for the property. However, if the property does have a mortgage on it, then that is deemed to be subject to stamp duty. So if you had a £500,000 property with a £100,000 mortgage on it, it's the £100,000 that would be potentially subject to stamp duty. In those cases as well, you would probably need to contact the mortgage advisor because since there'll be a change of ownership, they would need to be made aware to see if it's possible to novate that mortgage, or whether you need to move to a different mortgage provider. So yeah, it's something to be aware of when moving property into trusts.
The pension question, although the unused pension is inheritance tax free, if it devolves to higher rate taxpayers on death, is there any great advantage? Which is a brilliant question. So yes, pension death benefits, important to say, after the age of 75, they are subject to income tax in the hands of your beneficiaries. And it's a really good point to raise, but we would suggest there absolutely is an advantage in that with inheritance tax, there is no control over it. Once it's payable, and that's it. The estate is worth what it is at the end, and inheritance tax is applied. Whereas with a pension and with pension death benefits, there's much greater flexibility in terms of the timing of drawing down on that money by your beneficiaries, and therefore they have the ability to be able to control or influence the timing of any tax that they pay, and that can fit in with their wider tax situation. And indeed, pensions then can skip a generation and be left to the next generation of beneficiaries. So in summary, there is much more flexibility with pension death benefits when compared with inheritance tax.
Just a follow-up question on so if property is gifted into a trust, does this trigger a capital gain? So yes, that is correct. So if property is moved into a trust, it is technically sold at market value, and so there would be a capital gain. However, with discretionary trusts, there is the ability to hold over that gain. So in our example, we had a property worth £500,000. It was originally purchased for £200,000. So you have got that sort of unrealised gain of £300,000 there. But if you move that into a trust, you can hold over the gain so the trustees are deemed to acquire the property at the original purchase price of £200,000. What that does mean is if the trustees ever disposed of the property, they would be the ones that end up bearing the capital gains tax. However, with trusts on the way out, so in our example, we moved the property into trust for the son, and it could be in 9, 15, 20 years that the parents say, actually, we're happy for that trust to be wound up now and move the property direct into the son's personal name. On the way out of the trust, you can also hold over the gain again. So it's a good way, it's a potentially good way of moving assets that have large gains down a generation without triggering the capital gain. In that case, again, the child would ultimately hold the property at the original purchase price. So if they ever sold the property, they would trigger the gain. So you can't ever escape the gain, but you can defer it. And then Tamsin, I think there's just one more question on pensions as well.
Right, so can you nominate the beneficiary of a pension to be a trust? Yes, absolutely. Pension death benefits can fall into a trust. And in some situations, that can be the right thing to do. And in others, in actual fact, just leaving pensions through a nominated drawdown pension can be better from a tax point of view. So when pension after the age of 75, if pension benefits fall into trust, then when they go into trust, they suffer a 45% tax charge. So we do need to be a little bit careful with that. but in some situations it can be the right thing to do.
Yeah, and then finally, there's a couple of questions just on, are there costs for the trust, and is there a 10-year tax charge? And then a follow-up question on the 10-year anniversary tax on trusts. So as I say, this webinar, it was difficult to go into detail on everything, and hopefully, as I say, it's given you a flavour on things. However, discretionary trusts do suffer. So although they sit outside the estate for inheritance tax purposes, they have their own effectively inheritance tax regime. And every 10 years, the trust will suffer a tax charge, which is up to 6% of the value of the trust. However, the trust does receive a nil rate band itself, that 325,000. So it can help mitigate that liability. There's also the ability with trusts, which can be quite commonly used, where you might put a property in there in year 1 and you could take it out in year 9. So you never actually hit that sort of 10-year anniversary charge. There's also the option to sort of set up multiple trusts so that they each end up with their own nil rate bands. So they each have a tax-free threshold of 325,000 to help, again, mitigate any 10-year charges. But yeah, there are additional tax points with trusts, and when advising all of this, we would go into detail on that. But yeah, hopefully this webinar just gives a nice high-level flavour of the sort of planning available and the tools that are at our use. But yeah, I think that's all the questions. So yeah, thank you very much all for joining. And yeah, there will be a recording as well if any of you want to watch this or pass to any colleagues or family. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.